The Battle of Saipan stands as one of the most brutal and decisive struggles of the Pacific War. By July 1944, the island had become the focal point of two empires. For Japan, Saipan was the last line of defense before the homeland itself. For the United States, it was the springboard to victory, a place from which bombers could finally reach Tokyo. As the summer heat beat down on the volcanic soil, more than 30,000 Japanese troops were trapped in a shrinking pocket of the island. Supplies had run out, ammunition was scarce, and the once formidable imperial army was exhausted. But in the culture of Bushido, the warrior code, surrender was worse than death. Instead of laying down their arms, the Japanese prepared for one final act of defiance, a mass Banzai charge, an attack rooted more in tradition and honor than in military logic. To understand this moment, one must look back at the Japanese doctrine of Gyokusai, meaning to shatter like a jewel. It was the belief that it was more honorable for a soldier to die in a doomed attack than to be captured alive. This was not the first time American forces had faced such tactics. At Guadalcanal, at Tarawa, and in countless skirmishes across the Pacific, they had already witnessed the futility of Banzai charges against entrenched firepower. Artillery, mortars, and machine guns had shredded waves of Japanese infantry long before they could reach American lines. But Saipan was different. The sheer scale of what was about to come was unlike anything before. The largest Banzai charge of the Pacific War, and indeed the last of its kind, was about to unfold.
The American position. The U.S. Army's 27th Infantry Division and elements of the 105th Infantry Regiment held the northern sector of Saipan. They were weary, battered by weeks of fighting, but they had one decisive advantage: firepower. Behind their foxholes and sandbag walls lay the backbone of modern war: artillery. Artillery had evolved into the god of battle in the 20th century. While the Japanese relied on courage and close combat, the Americans depended on calculation and steel. Behind the front lines sat fire direction centers, where officers with maps, radios, and slide rules converted enemy sightings into firing coordinates. The precision of these calculations meant that American artillery could blanket a target area within minutes, or even seconds. A concept known as time on target, TOT, had become the most devastating technique. Multiple artillery batteries, sometimes scattered miles apart, would coordinate their fire so that their shells arrived at the target simultaneously. The result was psychological and physical devastation, hundreds of explosions raining down in the same instant, giving the enemy no time to take cover. This was the world the Japanese were walking into. Yet, bound by tradition, honor, and desperation, they prepared for the largest mass suicide assault of the Pacific War. The night of July 6th, as darkness settled over Saipan on July 6th, 1944, the Japanese High Command faced grim choices. Lieutenant General Yoshitsu Saito, the commander on Saipan, had already declared his fate: "I will advance to attack the enemy and die an honorable death." His words sealed the destiny of thousands of his men. Orders spread through the ranks. Soldiers fixed bayonets, checked their rifles, and whispered prayers. Wounded men were given swords and pistols. Even civilians, caught in the nightmare of total war, were pressed into service. The sound of chanting, of officers shouting encouragement, and the distant beat of war drums echoed through the tropical night. American patrols reported unusual noises in the darkness, but they could not yet comprehend the scale of what was coming. Some thought it might be a small probe, a night raid, or even the last gasp of an exhausted enemy. In reality, more than 3,000 men were preparing to hurl themselves against the American line in the largest single charge of the war. The calm before the storm. In the American trenches, soldiers of the 105th Infantry tried to sleep. Exhaustion weighed on them after days of constant fighting. Machine gunners checked their belts of ammunition, while mortar teams prepared flares in case of a night assault. The men trusted their artillery, the great unseen shield behind them. But no one could have anticipated the scale of what was about to happen. At 0445 hours, as the first gray light of dawn crept across the Pacific horizon, forward observers spotted movement. Shadows rippled across the field. Binoculars revealed mass formations of Japanese infantry, not creeping or crawling as in a normal assault, but marching in formation, shouting, banners waving, officers of the front. The radio crackled to life. Coordinates were called out, calculations scribbled onto plotting boards, orders relayed to the gun crews waiting in the rear. A single command passed through the airwaves. Fire mission. Time on target. The curtain rises. The story of the Saipan Banzai charge had begun. What followed would be an apocalypse of steel and fire, the death of an ancient way of war, and the beginning of a new chapter in modern military history. For the Japanese, it would be a march into legend. For the Americans, it would be survival through science and firepower. For history, it would mark the end of the Banzai charge forever. The hour was just before dawn on July 7th, 1944. The horizon over Saipan was stained with the first pale light of morning. A humid mist clung to the fields and ravines, shrouding the island in an eerie calm. For a moment, there was silence, then came the sound. From the Japanese lines rose a roar, primal and unyielding. Thousands of voices screamed a single word: Tenno Haika Banzai! Long live the Emperor! The ground trembled as more than 3,000 Japanese soldiers surged forward in unison. At their head rode officers wielding samurai swords, some in full uniform, others in tattered, blood-soaked bandages. Behind them stumbled the wounded, men with missing limbs supported by comrades, each determined to die in one final storm of steel. A sea of humanity. Eyewitnesses later described it as a wave of human bodies. From foxholes and ridges, American observers saw ranks of Japanese infantry cresting the horizon, rifles glinting in the dawn light, bayonets fixed. They were not advancing cautiously. They were charging openly, a tidal surge of humanity pouring across the fields, ignoring bullets, shrapnel, and even common sense. American machine guns opened first. The chatter of Browning .30 caliber weapons tore into the ranks, mowing down dozens in seconds. Still they came. Mortar crews lobbed shells into the mass, explosions ripping gaps in the advancing line. And yet, the screaming continued. The first radio reports were frantic. Large enemy movement, multiple formations, they're coming straight at us. Fire direction centers in the rear sprang into action. Coordinates were confirmed, firing tables checked, and calculations scribbled down at lightning speed. Then came the order every artilleryman trained for. Time on target, fire! Time on target. Miles behind the infantry line, American artillery crews worked with mechanical precision. Howitzers and field guns thundered to life, their barrels recoiling as shell after shell was rammed home and fired. The concept of time on target meant that dozens, sometimes hundreds, of shells would all strike at the exact same second. Observers described the effect as apocalyptic. One moment, the Japanese formations were charging across the field. The next, they were swallowed in simultaneous eruptions of fire and steel. The sky flashed orange as hundreds of detonations rolled across the battlefield. Men and earth alike were torn apart in the same instant, the shockwave staggering even the Americans in their trenches. But when the smoke cleared, to the astonishment of those watching, survivors were still moving. Bloody, limping, screaming, they pressed on. Some stumbled over the mangled bodies of their comrades, clutching rifles with shaking hands. Others charged headlong, bayonets leveled, eyes wild with fanaticism. The ladder of fire. American artillery officers quickly shifted tactics. Instead of striking only the front lines, they began ladder fire missions, bracketing explosions that marched forward and backward across the battlefield. Shells rained down in calculated patterns, slicing through every direction of advance. A survivor from the 105th Infantry Regiment recalled, "The ground in front of us was just churning, nothing but explosions. I couldn't believe anyone was still alive in it." But they kept coming. Every time the barrage lifted, there they were again. By 0500 hours, the battlefield had become an inferno. Entire Japanese companies were obliterated before reaching rifle range, yet scattered groups broke through the firestorm. American lines braced for impact, breaking through the storm. Despite catastrophic losses, sheer momentum carried hundreds of Japanese soldiers to the American trenches. Some leapt directly into foxholes, screaming and stabbing with bayonets. Others hurled grenades or swung rifles like clubs when their ammunition was gone. For the men of the 105th Infantry Regiment, it was chaos. Soldiers who had expected the artillery to annihilate the charge suddenly found themselves fighting hand-to-hand. Machine gunners fired until barrels overheated. Mortar crews abandoned their tubes and picked up carbines. Even cooks, clerks, and radio operators grabbed weapons to join the defense. The battle dissolved into dozens of savage, close-quarters fights. The cries of the wounded and the clash of steel against steel mingled with the relentless thunder of artillery behind them. Courage meets firepower. The Japanese charge revealed both the courage and the futility of such tactics. For every American position overrun, 10 more stood firm, supported by unbroken artillery fire. Where once Banzai charges might have carried the day in earlier wars, on Saipan, they were simply feeding men into a machine of calculated destruction. One American officer later described the sight. It was like watching men charge into a meat grinder. They knew they couldn't win, but they kept coming, wave after wave. I almost admired them, until I remembered they were killing my friends. The battlefield at dawn. As the sun climbed higher, the scale of destruction became clear. The fields in front of the 105th were littered with bodies, many still clutching their weapons, others sprawled as if frozen mid-charge. Smoke curled from the craters where entire platoons had been erased. The once ordered ranks of the Japanese army had dissolved into scattered bands of survivors, each determined to sell their life dearly. For the Americans, exhaustion set in. They had repelled the first great wave, but the charge was not yet over. Behind the carnage, more Japanese troops were preparing to surge forward. The largest Banzai charge of the Pacific War had only just begun. The morning of July 7th, 1944, turned Saipan into a battlefield unlike anything the Americans had yet faced in the Pacific. The first waves of the Japanese Banzai charge had been torn apart by artillery and machine guns, but sheer desperation drove survivors into the American lines. What followed was not the calculated science of war. It was chaos, confusion, and the raw brutality of men fighting face to face. The 105th Infantry Regiment under siege. By dawn, the 105th Infantry Regiment had absorbed the full weight of the Japanese onslaught. Though artillery had shattered the majority of the attackers, hundreds had broken through. Trenches, foxholes, and command posts became islands of desperate defense. The regiment's forward battalions were hit hardest. Small groups of Japanese soldiers infiltrated under cover of smoke and explosions. They attacked with grenades, bayonets, and even swords. In places, they outnumbered the defenders 3-1. One soldier remembered, it was bedlam. You'd fire at one, and 2 more would be on you. We weren't soldiers anymore. We were just fighting to stay alive. Lieutenant Colonel William O'Brien. Amid the chaos, individual acts of heroism shone like beacons. Lieutenant Colonel William O'Brien, commander of the 1st Battalion, 105th Infantry, refused to withdraw. When his position was surrounded, he stood on the line with his men, firing a pistol in each hand, encouraging them to hold. Even after being shot multiple times, O'Brien kept fighting. Witnesses reported that he stood atop a jeep, emptying his weapon into the charging enemy until he was finally cut down. His refusal to leave his post became a rallying cry for the survivors of the regiment. Private Thomas Baker. Another story etched into history was that of Private Thomas Baker. During the fighting, Baker was gravely wounded. Knowing he could not be evacuated without risking the lives of others, he asked to be left behind. A comrade propped him against a tree and placed a pistol with 8 rounds in his hand. Hours later, when American forces retook the position, they found Baker's body. The pistol was empty. Around him lay the corpses of 8 Japanese soldiers. His sacrifice embodied the grim determination of the day. Captain Benjamin Salomon, the surgeon who fought. Perhaps the most extraordinary story was that of Captain Benjamin Salomon, a dental surgeon serving as the regimental surgeon for the 105th. When the Japanese broke through to his aid station, Salomon realized that the wounded could not be moved. He seized a rifle from a fallen soldier, ordered the medics to evacuate, and took up defense of the tent alone. Hours later, his body was found slumped over a machine gun. Around him lay nearly 100 enemy dead. He had continued firing even after sustaining multiple wounds, buying precious time for the evacuation of his patients. Salomon's last stand remains one of the most remarkable examples of selflessness in American military history. The strain of close combat. These stories were not isolated. Across the line, men who had never expected to fight hand-to-hand suddenly found themselves grappling with bayonets, knives, even fists. Cooks, clerks, and medics picked up rifles to join the fight. Artillery still thundered in the background, but at this range, it was useless. The fight devolved into savage, personal combat. Soldiers described the horror of seeing comrades cut down at arm's length, the surreal mixture of discipline and raw instinct that drove them to keep going. Naval fire support. By mid-morning, American units were being pushed to their limits. Ammunition ran low, and casualties mounted. The 105th Regiment alone would lose more than 400 men killed that day, with hundreds more wounded. Then came the support of the Navy. Off the coast, battleships and cruisers opened fire, their heavy guns joining the chorus. Shells from the USS Tennessee and USS Louisville crashed into Japanese assembly points, annihilating the last organized formations before they could launch new charges. The ground shook as the island itself seemed to convulse under the bombardment. A battlefield of carnage. By late morning, the great Banzai charge was spent. What had begun as a mass of thousands was now reduced to scattered bands of wounded survivors, still attacking in 2s and 3s, unwilling to surrender. American lines were littered with bodies, both friend and foe, amid the wreckage of weapons and shattered earth. One officer described the sight. The field was nothing but bodies. Thousands of them, stacked, sprawled, crumpled. It was like nothing I had ever seen. And yet, among our own ranks, there were empty places too. Too many of them. The human cost. The heroism of men like O'Brien, Baker, and Salomon became legendary. But for most, the day was defined by survival. Soldiers staggered in shock, hands shaking as they reloaded, eyes fixed on the piles of dead before them. The Japanese had fought with extraordinary courage, but courage alone was no match for artillery, machine guns, and naval firepower. By the end of the morning, the largest Banzai charge in history had been destroyed. Yet the price was heavy. The 105th Infantry Regiment had nearly been decimated in the process. Its sacrifice, however, ensured that the American line held, and that Saipan would remain in U.S. hands. A turning point in warfare. The hand-to-hand fighting of July 7th was a brutal reminder of the cost of war. It was also a turning point, the last time the Imperial Japanese Army would ever launch a massed Banzai charge. The sheer scale of destruction made clear that in the modern age, courage and tradition could not overcome the cold efficiency of modern firepower. For the Americans who lived through it, the memory would never fade. For the Japanese, it was the final, tragic expression of Bushido on the battlefield. The Banzai charge had ended, not in glory, but in devastation. When the guns finally fell silent on July 7th, 1944, Saipan was a graveyard. More than 4,300 Japanese soldiers lay dead in front of the American lines, the largest single loss from a Banzai charge in the Pacific War. The ground was so thick with bodies that in some places one could walk across the field without ever touching the earth. For the Americans, victory came at a terrible price. The 105th Infantry Regiment had been mauled. Nearly 1,000 casualties were recorded, killed, wounded, or missing, making it one of the bloodiest single days for an American regiment in the Pacific. Survivors, dazed and hollow-eyed, staggered among the wreckage. They had endured the fury of one of history's last great mass infantry charges. The strategic consequences. The defeat of the Japanese on Saipan had consequences far beyond the battlefield. With the island secured, American bombers could now reach the Japanese homeland. The vast airfields of Saipan, Tinian, and Guam would soon host fleets of B-29 superfortresses capable of carrying the war directly to Tokyo. For Japan, the loss was catastrophic. Saipan was considered part of the inner defense line of the empire. Its fall shattered public confidence in Tokyo. News of the defeat reached the Japanese mainland in mid-July. Within days, Prime Minister Hideki Tojo, the face of Japanese militarism, resigned. His government collapsed under the weight of defeat. The people of Japan now knew what their leaders had long feared. The war could no longer be won. The end of doctrine. The Banzai charge at Saipan was not the first such attack, but it was the last on such a scale. Earlier in the war, at Guadalcanal or Tarawa, mass human assaults had at least caused confusion or temporary breakthroughs. But Saipan proved beyond doubt that against modern artillery, automatic weapons, and naval firepower, such tactics were nothing but suicide. The Japanese army would continue to fight with ferocity until the very end of the war. But never again would thousands charge en masse in the open. Instead, the Japanese turned to other methods: kamikaze attacks from the air, suicide missions at sea, and defensive warfare in caves and bunkers. The romanticized vision of the mass infantry charge, rooted in the traditions of Bushido, died on the fields of Saipan. The human dimension. For the American soldiers who survived, the memory of Saipan never faded. Veterans spoke of the horror of facing an enemy so determined to die. One GI remembered, "I didn't think they were human anymore. They just kept coming, even when they had no chance." It was like fighting shadows that wouldn't stop. Others admitted to conflicting emotions: admiration for the courage of their opponents, mixed with revulsion at the slaughter. The battlefield after the charge was described in words usually reserved for nightmares. The smell of blood and burned flesh hung in the humid air for days. Burial details worked endlessly to cover the dead, digging vast trenches to lay thousands to rest. 4 Japanese families back home, most never learned the details. They were told their loved ones had died honorably, charging the enemy. The truth, that they had been annihilated by artillery and machine guns, was rarely spoken. The larger lesson. Military historians often describe the Battle of Saipan as a clash between 2 eras of warfare. On one side stood the traditions of the samurai spirit, courage elevated above survival, a belief that death itself could be a weapon. On the other side stood the cold, industrial logic of modern war: artillery tables, fire direction centers, and the ruthless efficiency of firepower. The result was decisive. In a matter of hours, an entire army had been erased. Saipan demonstrated that modern war was not won by spirit alone, but by logistics, technology, and coordination. The lesson was not lost on future generations of commanders. Beyond Saipan, a world changed. From Saipan, the road to Japan itself lay open. The battles for Tinian and Guam followed swiftly, then Iwo Jima and Okinawa. Each was bloody, each more desperate than the last. But Saipan had set the precedent. When American B-29s rose from its airfields, they brought with them a new era of warfare: the strategic bombing campaign that would culminate in the destruction of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The fall of Saipan was also a turning point in Japanese society. The resignation of Tojo marked the beginning of cracks in Japan's war leadership. Although the war would grind on for another year, the illusion of invincibility was gone. For the first time, ordinary Japanese citizens realized that the homeland itself was vulnerable. Reflections. Looking back, the Banzai charge of Saipan remains one of the most dramatic and tragic episodes of the Pacific War. It was the last great gasp of a military culture unwilling to yield, even in the face of certain death. To some, it symbolized bravery in its purest form. To others, it was a senseless waste of human life. For the men who stood in the trenches that morning, it was something else entirely. It was survival. They had seen courage clash with firepower. They had learned that in the modern age, the two were not equals. One American veteran summed it up simply. It wasn't victory. It was slaughter. And I'll never forget it. Conclusion: the death of the charge. The fields of Saipan closed a chapter of history. For centuries, warriors had charged across open ground, swords and rifles in hand, believing that courage could carry them to victory. On July 7, 1944, that belief died in a storm of artillery fire. The Japanese soldiers of Saipan did not lack bravery. They lacked only what modern war demanded: machines, firepower, and the willingness to adapt. Their sacrifice was immense, their courage undeniable. But their charge was the last of its kind. Saipan stands today not only as a battlefield, but as a lesson. It teaches us that war is no longer decided by sheer willpower, but by the brutal arithmetic of technology and firepower. And it reminds us of the terrible cost when tradition collides with modernity. The Banzai charge ended on Saipan, not in glory, but in silence, among the ashes of thousands who ran headlong into history's final proof that courage alone is not enough.